As we conclude our Season 1 episodes in December, we're eager to hear from you about your preferences for Season 2 programming. You can send us an email, a message on LinkedIn, or send a voice message on our website. We value your input and appreciate your continued support. Remember to explore our continuing education programs on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Now onward to today's episode. Indigenous cultures hold a profound and intricate understanding of healing and wellness, deeply intertwined with their connection to community, spirituality, and the natural world. For psychologists seeking deeper meaning in their practice and exploring alternative approaches to client connection, what are the wisdoms passed down through generations of Indigenous knowledge? What are the examples in embracing a holistic approach that honors the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit, and to translate that to psychotherapy practice? In the past several decades, Latinx psychologists and professional organizations have embarked on a journey to rediscover Indigenous practices, seeking to integrate them in therapeutic approaches that resonate with the diverse populations they serve. What might that look like at the community level and going beyond the individualistic level? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zhen. Our guest today is Dr. Manuel Zamarripa, the co-director and co-founder of the Institute of Chicana, Chicano, Chicana-X Psychology based in Austin, Texas. He is a trained licensed psychologist, clinician, college dean, and currently the president of the National Latinx Psychological Association. As a previous academic program director and associate professor, he was awarded the University of Texas System Chancellor's Innovations in Education Award in 2007. Dr. Zamarripa has been featured on NPR and in the LA Times. Dr. Zamarripa's publications and presentations in psychology and education focuses on Chicana, Chicano, Chicana-X well-being, racial responsiveness, cultural revitalization, social justice, and leadership. Currently, as part of his work at the Institute of Chicana, Chicano, Chicana-X Psychology, Dr. Zamarripa conducts community workshop practicas as well as professional development training for educators and mental health professionals on issues related to the Chicana, Chicano, and Chicana-X wellness, cultural identity, and mental health from that perspective. Today, Dr. Zamarripa will be discussing the way in which he is using liberation and healing through his work at the Institute and the leadership as the current president in NLPA. We like to invite listeners to learn more about the Institute, sign up for the newsletter, as well as connect with the larger work being done through the National Latinx Psychological Association. Dr. Zamarripa, thank you so much for being on the People of Color in Psychology podcast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation and all the work that you're doing with this podcast. It's fantastic.
Well, you're welcome. And I was looking for guests and I did not realize that you're actually based here in Austin, Texas. So I'm delighted because I'm based here in Austin as well.
Isn't that funny? It's wild. We didn't realize that. So hopefully after all this, we can find some time to connect in person.
Yeah, I would love that. Now, you've done some amazing work. I mean, all the different roles that you have taken on throughout the years. Before we get into that, can you walk us through your journey, share with us any memorable events and circumstances that may have influenced how you got into this work?
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think for me, I have memories as a child growing up in San Antonio, Texas. For whatever reason, I think I was very aware of the racial and ethnic dynamics. And in San Antonio, there's a history of primarily, Chicano or Mexican American or Latinx community and the larger white community. We have a strong, of course, African American population as well as others, but that's kind of been the the more recent history of that community. So I was always aware of those dynamics, and I think what initially got me interested was the educational equities or inequities that I noticed. But as my interest grew, as I grew up, I really felt that the best way to address some of that was through the field of psychology. And I was always happy to see that psychology had always had some role in addressing inequities. I think more so in more recent history, but so I was always trying to, from a young age, see how psychology could really support the movements toward social justice and equality. And I remember in college, one of the things that stands out to me is I was in the library researching some type of paper that I forgot what type of paper, but I was doing research, and I, by accident, came across a book with the title Chicano Psychology. And this was in the early 90s. And of course, the story that so many of us are familiar with is, wow, I didn't know that people were doing this work, whether it's other, BIPOC communities, work that has been done by a lot of our communities over the centuries, but not acknowledged, right? Or not mainstreamed. So that was my personal experience as well. It's like, wow, I had no idea this existed. And so looking through that, I saw it was published in the 1970s. So even further, amazement that if it was published in the 70s, well, then people had been doing the work even before that. So that was that awakening. And that was the first time I was able to really clearly see a path to intentionally integrate this sense of social justice, equality, civil rights with the psychology that I wanted to do. That was coming across that book it was important because it showed that people had been doing it. And up to then I had been thinking to myself, how am I going to integrate this on my own? So that was key. I think as I continue to learn more about that history and try to continue with some of the work that has been, that had been done, that led me to early on my interactions and my role with the NLPA, the National Latinx Psychological Association, because through my discovery of all the work that had been done, it kind of happened around the time that NLPA began to formulate. It had its roots in the 70s as the National Hispanic Psychological Association that was discontinued for over a decade. And so then when the National Latinx Psychological Association happened early in my career, it was right around that time where I had been doing all this discovery. So it was a nice continuity to see, the work was continuing. And obviously I think the last piece for me was about 15 years ago, where I also began to, everyone's talking about, well, not everyone, but a lot of people are talking about this idea of decolonization. And I started coming into that in my own life, reconnecting to Indigenous roots and Indigenous ways of being, along with my life partner, my wife, my duality. And so as a family, we had found connections and began walking, what a lot of Indigenous people call walking the red road, which is walking a path that is primarily guided by Indigenous ways of being and knowing. And so I knew a little bit of our history, which is that, in the United States, our Native and Indigenous people are, Native Americans from what we call the northern natives. But as we know, this whole continent was indigenous before the Europeans came, right? So even though we do have this identity, which is true over the last 500 years of, have a Latinx identity in general, it's also been important to me in the work that we do that we really truly don't just acknowledge like, oh yes, we have Indigenous roots and we have European roots, but that we really understand what it means to have Indigenous roots. And that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But so all of that has kind of culminated or has culminated in the formation of the Institute. And it's also been the guide for the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years with the National Latinx Psychological Association. So it's been nice to be able to walk in those two worlds.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely quite a path you took to start from early on recognizing some of the inequities in education, which I'd be curious actually early on, what did you notice? And then as you were noticing those inequities, formulating sort of a blueprint to try to figure out why this was happening and going beyond it and discovering that, oh, psychology has a place to help me answer some of this. And as you were describing, opening that textbook, I can't help but also light up because it must have felt so nice to be able to connect and identify with, your culture, identity, and see that on paper and in many ways affirm that, hey, we matter, our viewpoints matter. Uh, and then, of course, the development and emergence of decolonial approach, that is another topic of discussion too, that I'd be curious from your lens. And all that coming together to where you are today, having the Institute, doing trainings, and also being a leader in the NLPA, I think that is quite a fantastic journey. So with that, kind of going back, what were some of the inequities that you noticed early on?
Thank you. Yes, I think, again, for me, in my context of San Antonio, Texas, at least through my experience in my eyes, as a young kid, I was really able to notice and see some of those differences in education opportunities, and to notice that a lot of the brown kids, and where there were other ethnic minority kids, could just see that the schools that were attended were, through a kid's eyes, right, never seemed to be, always seemed to be struggling. I'll add another layer, because both my parents were working class, but they were able to move from an area in San Antonio that was long, Chicano, Mexican, American, Latinx community, overwhelmingly low socioeconomic status, to a more lower to middle class neighborhood where I grew up. But all of our family still lived in the other barrio neighborhood. So we were always going back, and it always kept that connection for me. Another layer was that my parents were really big in Catholic school education, right? So me and my sister went to elementary school and Catholic school education, and they were always talking about how dangerous public school kids were. It was this narrative that as a kid, I almost had a fear of, if there was a kid walking down the block and I thought they were from public school, I just didn't want to talk to them because of all of this kind of narrative in these schools about, how dangerous public school kids were. And of course, they were always darker skinned, or, they were always, the kids that were kids of color. And so I can articulate all this now, but those kind of were these pieces that stuck with me. And of course, my parents always kind of talked a little bit about cultural pride, and always, politics always came up here and there about, the poor people and the people of color always kind of getting the short end of the stick. And so I think I was able to put and I'm I don't know if you can see it to the camera or not, but I'm pretty brown skinned. And one of the things I remember is noticing just that my forearms were browner. I just have that memory, just noticing that they were brown as compared to a lot of my other classmates. And so when I kind of had those inklings, then through like middle school and high school, when you learn kind of history and civics and all of that, I started, noticing that where there was a civil rights movement, so there were struggles for desegregation, I started poking at the history around San Antonio, and of course noticed that Mexican Americans were also segregated throughout the Southwest and other places. I started, for some reason, discovering the school district's lawsuits for equal funding the inequitable funding. And San Antonio School District turned out to be the most famous inequity in terms of school funding case in U.S. history. And it took like 20 years. Ultimately, the Supreme Court came down with the decision that the education is not a fundamental right.
Oh
And
my gosh.
so that was all in and around San Antonio. So I kind of was in this environment, and I think just all those pieces kind of made me attuned to this. And so where psychology comes into this is, as I began to learn about psychology more, of course, there's the mental health piece, right? The clinical and counseling, but it's a larger field. And where I saw psychology is it always had within it the study of identity development and cultural identity development and ethnic identity development. And I began to notice, of course, that a lot of my peers, we really didn't get validation or education of our own history and our own identity development. So that when I was learning all these things, and some of my friends cared about it, some of them didn't, I was talking, what occurred to me was like, we really, nothing really enforces and validates and grows our sense of who we are culturally. It's like we're invisible. And so that's what led me really into the field of psychology, was the work in identity development. And then, of course, how that connects to our overall wellness, our overall well-being, just our general sense of having a solid sense of self.
Hmm. It's almost as though it's a consequence of racism, racist structures,
Mhm.
where our identity development just isn't addressed and eventually just washed away. And hence, I think it's a very important journey that many psychologists must take, especially BIPOC psychologists, to be able to do this self-exploration. And now, the work that you're doing with your institute, can you tell me more, what you're doing for the community? What are you doing with clients? Like, tell me more about your institute.
Thank you so much. One of the things we wanted to do with the Institute was it's more of a community-based institute. In other words, it's not connected to another like university or it's freestanding. And one of the things that I loved about discovering Chicano psychology and all the connections and looking at all the work that a lot of these psychologists were doing, one of the things, of course, that stood out for me was, how can I communicate this to my community that I can see would benefit? So, when I first started in the field, I went into academia, I got tenure, I did all those things that were really great. But I ultimately left, not, I always say it wasn't a bad divorce, a contentious divorce. It was just simply these other voices were calling this, to be more intentional. So what I wanted to do was take what was being done, some of the stuff I was doing, but others, and communicate it in a way that made sense to the community. So we started having these community workshop pláticas, in Spanish, just kind of like gatherings, talk about issues like identity and, family relationships, family interactions, spirituality, which is, really an important piece. All the different areas that we could hear our community was struggling with and needed support around. And so we would integrate some of the work that was being done, some of the research, in a format that, wasn't like a presentation, but it was in a format that we used some key information, but then we really engaged and had the community also ask questions, respond, interact, and just made it very applicable to, what made sense for them. So it was a back and forth, like, what's going on in this area? We hear you. What are the struggles? What's happening? Oh, and as you're saying that, here's some of this research that's been done by these psychologists. How does that connect or not connect to where you're at, to what you're doing? And people began to respond to that. And we were doing it because we just felt like this is a gap. And so we didn't know whether people were going to respond or not. We just felt it was the right thing to do. So of course, though, from my training, I also wanted to connect with clinicians to kind of deepen, have other conversations around how do we really connect with our clients of color, with Latinx clients. So based on this work, we also started offering clinical trainings. Some of the initial ones were like browning your counseling, and we do a Chicanx affirmative therapy training. And so we started saying like, well, we have to do both community workshops and offering clinical trainings. And so that's kind of the format we've been following. And people have been responding and connecting. So it's been a good evolution.
And so if folks are interested in learning more about these workshops and learning to work with Latinx Chicano communities, and you're delivering these workshops for clinicians, is that correct?
Yes, we do clinician workshops as well. Yes, for sure.
Okay. So we'll post your contact information on a show note so they can definitely reach out. The other part too you mentioned, which is this deep connection, and we are right now in the month of November doing this recording, and of course, the hope is that we're creating a Native American heritage series. So can you tell me more about some of the Indigenous work that you're doing?
Thank you. Yes, all of this has been developing in real time with me in my personal and professional life. And one of the things that I began noticing was as me and my family began to reconnect to Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous healing and spirituality, learning from, we have our elder here in Austin and other surrounding elders that have been walking this path, is of course every people have their way of looking at the world and looking at what they call on in their experience for health and healing and wellness. And so as we began to connect to our, primarily Mexica or Aztec ways of knowing, recognizing that there were a lot of different peoples in that area, but just that's the medicine we connect with. We honor sacred energies that are around us, and every sacred energy has a way of helping us be in balance. And so just on my own in that path, noticing that as a psychologist, where some of these parallels were. So for example, almost all Indigenous peoples connect with the four sacred elements, around us: earth, wind, fire, water. Everyone has a little bit different interpretation and connection with that based on their experience. But the element of the wind is also the element of our breath, which connects to our voice. So it began to occur to me like, well, as clinicians, we use our voice often. And so we began to invite people that wanted to connect and to learn more, invite them to think about, to connect with, well, you can do this work as a clinician, and if you want to connect spiritually, this is what we're offering. So when you're doing your healing work, we invite you to connect to the sacred element of the wind. So whenever you go outside, you feel the breeze, that is a reminder, like, are you using, for example, your voice in a way that you want? Are you in alignment? Or even with clients, making that suggestion, like if they are having struggles with their voice, when you go outside and you feel the wind, you feel the air, we invite you to, if you'd like, to see that can also be a connection to the sacred element of the wind. And it could be your reminder, are you using your voice in the way you want to? And so for me, that is also psychology 101, because then people are like, well, I'm very careful about wisdom and knowledge versus ceremony. I just don't do ceremony with everyone because that can be very sacred and important, but ways of knowing can also, can be helpful. So as therapists, we'll set a random timer to remember what we talked about, put a rubber band around your wrist. Like if you think of the template, people have always had ways of helping, but we haven't connected with indigenous ways of knowing. Everything's Western, everything's passed down to us, which is not bad, right? But what it does on a larger scale is like I'm dealing with my community. We all have our own histories, right? My community that has always been taught that psychology and healing is from Western ways, which the mainstream is, right? And this is the way to help. What I've been saying is I invite you to think about the fact that your ancestors also had very similar ways of healing and wellness. And if you want to talk about balance, there's the Ometeo, in Mexico, Ome meaning two, and Nahuatl and Teo meaning creation or sacredness. And so it's just the sacredness of two, of duality, of balance. And so for us, mental health is being in balance and mental struggles is being out of balance. So you can take a workshop from a Western perspective, which is fine, about how to balance your life. Or you can connect with this idea of the Ometeo, which comes from your lineage, which comes from your ancestral DNA, which you can connect with. And for me, that goes back to what you were saying earlier. How do we become culturally affirmed when everything is being erased? Well, one way is to know that as I learn about my healing and as I get mentally in balance, at a minimum, I'm using frameworks, and frameworks is, I hesitate to use that. That's Western because these are very passed down, I say sacred concepts, right? You can do the Western, get in balance workshop, or you can connect to the ways in which your ancestors found balance. And so our kids can say, hey, we know this stuff and it comes from us. There's nothing wrong with learning something new, but it's like the only way to get healthy and well, our community has found, like a lot of communities of color, is to learn the white Western way. We don't always call it that, but and so what's really important is can you find your indigenous ways? And there is some really great culturally responsive psychology, which can walk alongside these indigenous ways if it's in alignment. But I think that's true for all people of color. And that's why it's if we reconnect to some of those ways, then we can have that direct and indirect learning that this comes from our own peoples. And I think that does a lot for cultural affirmation, for cultural identity development, for a sense of pride and wellness and well-being. And so connecting to, as I said, the elements is one way, just a small example in our time here, but everyone has sacred energies of the seasons. We're in fall right now. So for a lot of Nahuatl and Mexica peoples, that's the sacred energy of Xipatotec, which sheds its own skin, but not in a Western violent way, to let things go, right? And so a lot of communities, we all know that fall is when the leaves fall in autumn, but there was a real sacred intentional connection to this time of the year where you let things fall. You let things that don't serve you fall away. How are you going to do that? I mean, you can see really easily how that can integrate into mental health work, clinical work. We're coming into winter. Winter is a time of reflection. Winter is a time of introspection. Winter is the time of our ancestors. And so this could be a time where maybe we don't produce as much. Maybe we stop saying yes to appointments. Maybe we reflect. Maybe we pause. Maybe we see the good things about winter and the darkness of winter. How can that be helpful? And so to me, that's where I see what I call, that's part of our liberation and our healing, is reconnecting to some of these ways. And it's not about romanticizing them. It's just each of our communities should be able to articulate and connect with the ways that all of our communities have healed and benefit from culturally responsive Western psychology as well. But I think we inadvertently accept that that way of psychology is, the way. And I think that's been part of what we've been trying to put out there, is that it can be a good way, but not the only way.
Gosh, I thank you so much for sharing this with me. And I love the way you are very diligent and honoring the language and how you describe, say, the wisdom practices that have been passed down by generations of the indigenous folks. And rather than using the word framework, right? This is the wisdom that they have
Yes.
passed on. And it's so practical where we're stepping outside, there's the wind, there's the sun, there's heat.
Mhm.
And in many ways, we've lost the connection to that. And thank you for bringing that awareness piece, because it feels so freeing and liberating as you were describing the process to me. And I hope listeners, as they are listening to this, that they themselves also felt a little bit of that vitality that you just shared with us. So I really appreciate that. So the part about being the president of NLPA,
Yes, yes.
you have a lot on your plate. Y'all just had a conference, and so I'm wondering, what would you like our listeners to know about NLPA?
I think I would invite all of our listeners to please look at the NLPA website. It's a really exciting time for our organization, whether you're Latinx or whether you're an ally or want to know more, because what NLPA does is it brings together such a wealth of knowledge of people that have knowledge, that have been doing this for their whole career. And that's when I talk about, the trainings that I do, but I tap into what some of these other great researchers are doing, that helps guide the work that I'm doing. I'm so grateful that they are in there doing the work. And NLPA allows people to be in community with all of those that are kind of at the forefront of Latinx psychology. And we have some people that have been doing this for 30, 40 years, and we have the up and coming people, students and new professors and new researchers and practitioners. And if you want to know how to best serve Latinx community and where I think, again, with the culturally responsive, good science, is coming from, I think tap in to NLPA. It's a good time to be a member. We just had our conference in Chicago, and we had about 600 participants. It was a good conference. I think we're up to close to 1,000 members right now. We're in a good place to join and see what's happening. And we need people to keep this going. I mean, I don't want there to be a time like when I saw that Chicano psychology book in the early 90s and had to learn by accident some of this history, and to know that the National Hispanic Psychological Association started in the 70s and then just kind of fell off. And luckily, in the late 90s, people regrouped again, and now we've had NLPA for over 20 years. And so, but the only way that happens is if we continue to build that narrative. I mean, it's unbelievable, the intellectual wealth in terms of the members that we have, that people can tap into from all different aspects of Latinx psychology, whether it's child psychology, whether it's school psychology, whether what's happening with migration and immigration and trauma, cultural identity. I think connecting with this association is a gem. It's a key resource, and it's a wide tapestry. Last year, our conference focused on the integration of health, medical health, with psychology, right? And the dynamic of health and healthcare. And this year, based on everything we've talked about as the current president, of course, my focus was on Indigenous wisdom, right? So we had a lot of focus on indigeneity. And next year, for the first time ever, we're going to have the conference in Puerto Rico. And so it's going to be, again, celebrating the wide tapestry of what Latinx psychology is. And I think that is what makes us strong, is to be able to remember that we have this shared history and that we need to speak as a community. That's, I think, the case with a lot of communities of colors. We have specific histories, but we also have things that bind us together, and we need to be able to share our own histories, but also speak as a collective when we need to. And I think that's important as well.
In your career as a person of color, what were some challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
Wow, that's a great question. I think there's so many things I could say, but I think one of the challenges has been, as much as I have professionally grown up in the multicultural movement. I remember when culturally the Counseling Diverse by Sue and Sue was like a second edition or third, like I remember that. And so as much as the field has grown in that way, we still have struggles in terms of this psychology matters. And I think part of the struggle that I'll address with you specifically has been because people have talked about multicultural psychology. That was the term, in classes, because that has begun to be part of curriculums. As I've been doing my work, part of the challenge has been, why are we talking? I remember there was a workshop we did a long time ago. It was like, are we talking culture again? It was like, some people that really haven't integrated it, still feel like, what? Well, there's these multicultural classes. You have these ethnic psychological associations. Like, what's the problem? And it's kind of like the 10 o'clock news desensitization type of effect, where you know they hear this, oh, we need multicultural training, but they've never really, as a field, we've never really systematically integrated it. So it has the effect of, for example, a person hearing the same words and then they just kind of like become desensitized or maybe even annoyed. So the challenge has been, not sometimes it's not present, but when it is, when we do this work, it's like, why is this still necessary? Like, why are we talking about culture again? And letting people know that it's not just another topic. It's the way we approach, human wellness and well-being. And what the field doesn't notice is that it's primarily come from a Western individualistic perspective. And until we expand that to beyond individualism, then we're really not going to have a truly kind of global psychology.
Yeah, and a true appreciation for humanity.
Correct. Right. And so I guess the way I've addressed it is my work with the Institute, my work with NLPA is just noticing what I see are the gaps coming from my positionality in this world and trying to just move forward. And another thing that, my partner, Jessica, my duality in all this work with me, she is not a psychologist, but she is a mental health advocate, a community organizer, and she is a medicine. I would say she's a healer, medicine woman in this way. But we do our work together. And one of the things is sometimes we have to decolonize from this rush, the rat race we said, but we know what not to do. But sometimes what we do is we honor the turtle's pace, right? We look at nature around us and we see what connects with us. So there's so much work to do. And that has also been a challenge, which is why I kind of am here. I'm kind of there. I'm here because I'm like, I need to respond to this and do this. But really at the same time, sometimes we get frustrated and it's like, well, are you doing the work that you want to do? Are you being genuine? Are you being authentic? Are you being intentional? Sometimes for some of us, that work's going to move a little slower. Look at the turtle, one of the oldest, wisest animals on the planet. Sometimes honor that pace. Like being what's seemingly slow isn't always back,
It's not
right?
valued,
Right?
unfortunately,
It's not valued. That is
in
not
Western
valued.
culture. Yeah,
It's not
it's
valued.
very
So
unfortunate. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Dr. Zamarripa, any final thoughts?
I'm just really grateful. I just feeling a lot of gratitude for you creating this space for so many of us. And I want to ask forgiveness if I have said anything, that was offensive or that I mistakenly said incorrectly, because I just hope that anytime we have conversations like this to come in a good way. And I just want to say that I hope they come in a good way. I want to thank you. I'll say that in Nahuatl, which is Tlasokamati. Thank you. And just appreciate the spaces that you are inviting us to.
You're welcome. And thank you so much for the phenomenal work and leadership that you're heading up with NLPA. Fantastic members, fantastic leadership committees. I mean, we even had a few of them on our previous episodes. So y'all are definitely doing some amazing work. I'll link the membership link on our show notes and definitely include that. Well, Dr. Zamarripa, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color and Psychology. Other ways to support us include registering for continuing education courses or making a donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. We value your input and appreciate your continued support. You can send us an email, a message on LinkedIn, or send us a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.